Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And today, we're going to be talking about werewolves, my favorite monster, werewolves. It is the first week of Horror Mayhem at the time of this recording. And that's all about, the first week of Horror Mayhem is all about supernatural creatures and monsters and that sort of thing. And my favorite monster is the werewolf. So I read about werewolves this week. I read two novels about werewolves. The first novel I read is The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore, and I also read The Forsaken Boy by Troy Tradup. So, The Werewolf of Paris and The Forsaken Boy. And it was interesting reading these two books, one right after the other. They're very different books, and yet, because they're both about werewolves, they had some strong similarities. And not just because they were about werewolves, but kind of the type of werewolf that you have show up in these stories. So it was an interesting experience reading these one right after the other. This one came out in 1933. This is kind of a classic, The Werewolf of Paris. It's not a horror classic in the class of Frankenstein or Dracula, but it is kind of a classic in its own way. Definitely as far as werewolf novels go. And Guy Endore's novel, The Werewolf of Paris, it's an entertaining read, I have to say that. Really interesting book, full of sex and violence and worse. This is strong stuff. It was a bestseller when it was first published, and I'm not surprised. Pretty dark and transgressive for its time, I think. I think if Juan at Plagued by Visions had been around in the 30s, if Plagued by Visions had been an amateur publication or an amateur magazine or something, he would have written about The Werewolf of Paris, considering the type of book that it is, about a young man, Bertrand, who is born a werewolf. Guy Endore goes pretty far into the backstory of this character, where he talks about the horrific family that this kid came from. He is the last of the line, and his family was, well, they were terrible people. And it goes quite deeply into the backstory of how his curse developed. And so basically, he was born with the curse. So he's an innocent. He had nothing to do with the events that led to this werewolf curse. He is the victim of it. And he is raised by his mother and his step-uncle. And his step-uncle figures out quite early that Bertrand is a werewolf. He figures that out pretty early, and he tries to figure out what to do. He thinks about killing Bertrand. He can't bring himself to do that. He does end up periodically imprisoning him in his home and try some other things to keep the wolf at bay. Bertrand, in the beginning, just experiences strange dreams of being a werewolf, although he doesn't realize that's what he is, or that's what he's dreaming about. But of course, his dreams are real. He really is this horrific supernatural creature. And as he gets older, it gets worse, and he finds he cannot fight off his curse. He is a complete victim to it, and horrible things ensue for this kid. And so this novel goes into great detail about his struggles with his curse, the horrific results of his curse, and the efforts of his uncle to do something about it. It's interesting. Bertrand is an interesting character. He is, like I said, an innocent who is afflicted with this terrible curse, and he has to deal with it. And it leads him to just horrific crimes and overshadows his whole life, of course, as it would. And in the meantime, there's lots of other stuff going on in the background. The Franco-Prussian War, for example, is part of the background of this novel. It's a really interesting read. And it probably should be better known nowadays than it is. I was really surprised by the amount of sex and how graphic the violence was. Incest shows up in this. I mean, there's stuff in this book that you're just like, man, really? I could, like I said, I could kind of see why this was a bestseller upon its publication, just because it must have seemed, kind of titillating to the 1930s audience. All the stuff that was going on in this book. But I don't hear it talked about too much anymore, The Werewolf of Paris. So it deserves a revisit. It's true the pacing is a little odd in this book. There's way too much stuff that happens before our werewolf is even born. Guy Endore is very careful to explain the entire backstory of this character and all the events that happened before his birth, which led to the curse. And there's probably too much of that. In fact, I know there's too much of that. But otherwise, excellent story. And it was an interesting read, and I highly recommend you check this out, The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore. And from there, I moved on to The Forsaken Boy by Troy Tradup, which is another novel about a young man who becomes a werewolf. Now, in this one, he's not born a werewolf. He becomes a werewolf. Now, this young guy in this novel, Brandon, he's an outcast in the small town that he lives in. He's been bullied. He's not accepted by anybody except that he has one friend and his friend's mother, and that's it. Everybody else pretty much hates this kid, including his father. His father is pretty terrible. Everybody is pretty terrible for the most part to poor Brandon, except his best friend and his best friend's mother. And Troy Tradup is very careful in the beginning of this book to build up this character of Brandon. And so you get to know this character and you get to care about this character. That is very skillfully done. The character work, for the most part in this book, is really, really good. The plot itself, it's a pretty creature features plot in that a lot of the things that you expect to be in this book is in this book. The basic structure of the story itself is a familiar one. It's the way it's done that makes it interesting. And while most of the characters are really well drawn in this book, there are some characters that aren't. Basically, all the bad characters, they just could have V's on their head because they're so villainous. And you just know that they're going to get theirs, You know something bad's going to happen to these folks. Because Brandon here runs into a werewolf, and he is changed into a werewolf. Now, the way that happens is really interesting. All of that stuff about how he's turned into the werewolf and how the beginning of his curse starts, that's all done in a really interesting way, and in a way that I hadn't really seen before. So that was really good stuff. And at the beginning, unlike our poor character in this book, he actually likes being a werewolf. He's attracted to the idea of being a werewolf because it's the first time he's had any sense of power in his life. He's always been put upon, this kid. But now, finally, he's got a sense of strength and power. And he has the control now that he's the werewolf. At least he thinks he does at the beginning of this curse. But the curse itself, as werewolf curses will, changes him. And the way it does is fascinating and tragic. There's a lot of tragedy in this story. It's a very dark, dark story, but really compellingly done. Really excellent book, actually. I was pretty impressed by this one. It's not perfect. Like I said, a lot of the things that you expect to happen in this book do happen. One-dimensional villains. And the police officers in this are terrible. In this small town of Talbot's the name of the town, which is a nice touch. Terrible police department in this town, I have to say. But other than that, and those are quibbles, but other than that, this is a really, really good book. You really feel for Brandon, and also his best friend, his best friend's mother, all of these characters, and some other characters in this book. You really feel for them, and when things start to go wrong in this book, it matters. One of the best werewolf novels I think I've read. This one, and I think I liked it better than the Werewolf of Paris, frankly. So this is really good. This was originally published in 2010. This is a new edition, and I do highly recommend it. If you like creature features, if you like horror, if you like werewolves, I particularly recommend this. The way the werewolf curse is done, and how being a werewolf is presented, it's really interesting. And it shows quite a bit of imagination. And I appreciated that. So one of the more interesting takes on just the monster itself can be found in this book. And reading both of these together was a really interesting experience. If you have both these books, read these books both one after the other, and it's really interesting. I recommend them both. Okay, I'll stop talking now. Thanks, guys, for joining me, and I will catch you next time.